A man stands at a stove on a Tuesday night for no occasion at all. I notice that nothing is being celebrated, and yet the knife work is exact. He lines the cutting board parallel to the counter edge before touching a single onion, a small adjustment no one else in the room would ever think to check. You have seen this before, in a kitchen that was not performing for anyone. The precision here is not decoration, because no one is watching him measure the salt by feel. I register that this ritual repeats on nights with no guests, no children present, no reason external to itself. He checks the pan temperature with the back of a hand rather than a thermometer he owns and ignores. You recognize the confidence of someone who trusts a body more than an instrument, a trust built through repetition rather than instruction. This raises a question that refuses to stay small. Why does a private, unwitnessed act require this much order? The order itself is the first clue that something beneath cooking is being managed. I watch the sequence extend beyond this one evening into a pattern that spans years. He does not cook one dish twice in the same week, but he returns to the same 5 techniques on a loop. You start to see that variation exists only at the surface, while the underlying structure never moves. Searing, deglazing, reducing, resting, plating, in that order, every time, regardless of the ingredient placed in front of him. I notice that even spontaneity here has been rehearsed until it no longer feels like spontaneity. You begin to sense that the ritual is doing something other than producing dinner. The dinner is almost incidental to whatever the ritual is actually maintaining. I notice that he times each stage without a clock, purely by smell and sound. You realize that this internal timing has been trained over hundreds of repetitions no one else witnessed. What is being maintained becomes the real question, and it cannot be answered by watching the food alone. The generation attached to this man supplies an explanation that arrives without being invited. He came of age inside an economy that stopped promising anything in return for loyalty. I trace this back to institutions that broke their implicit contracts one after another, quietly, without ceremony. Pensions disappeared, companies were sold, departments were cut regardless of tenure or performance, and none of it required his consent. You can watch this history sit underneath his hands, even though he never mentions it while cooking. Alongside the economic shift, technology arrived asking for total adaptation without offering total belonging. He learned new systems every few years, each one erasing the fluency he had just built. I noticed that mastery, once achieved, stopped being a stable asset in his working life. This instability did not stay contained in the workplace. It moved into every domain requiring reliability. The kitchen offered one of the only spaces left where mastery, once earned, still counted as permanent. I notice that he speaks about knife skills with more certainty than he speaks about his career trajectory. You can hear the difference between a competence tested by an unstable market and one never subject to layoffs. This asymmetry in confidence is not incidental, it reflects where trust was allowed to settle safely. Labor changed shape around him in ways that rewarded flexibility over depth. I see a man whose father may have had one trade for 40 years.
He has had several roles, several employers, several reinventions inside a single working life. You notice that emotional culture shifted alongside this, asking men to be expressive without teaching them fluency. He was handed the expectation of openness without being handed a vocabulary for it. I watch this gap show up not as silence, but as displacement into something with visible technique. Cooking became a language that did not require naming a feeling directly, a language fluent in gesture rather than in words. Responsibility also widened during his adulthood, spreading beyond providing income into providing presence, attentiveness, domestic labor. None of these conditions alone explains the ritual fully. They only explain why a ritual was necessary at all. I noticed that this same generation absorbed conflicting messages about masculinity in rapid succession without a stable transition between them. He was raised on one model of restraint and asked mid-adulthood to practice an entirely different model of openness. You can see the residue of that whiplash in how selectively he applies emotional language, fluent in some rooms and silent in others. What becomes clear is that no single adaptation could carry this much weight by itself. Several mechanisms are operating underneath the same set of hands at once. I recognize that what looks like one habit is actually layered activity. Behavior sits on top of pattern, pattern sits on top of identity, identity sits on top of obligation. Obligation connects to relationship, relationship connects to meaning, meaning connects to something larger than any single life. 7 layers organize themselves the moment the surface stops being sufficient as an explanation. Naming them changes nothing yet, because naming is not the same as understanding their function. The moment the last layer is named, the investigation moves directly into the first one. There is no pause for introduction, because introduction has already happened through observation. The first layer holds only what can be seen directly, without inference. He arranges tools before he begins, always in the same left-to-right sequence. I notice he wipes the blade after every cut, whether or not residue is visible. You watch him taste from the same spoon repeatedly, rather than switching spoons like a beginner would. He never consults a recipe while cooking something he has made more than 3 times. I see him plate food with visible attention to negative space, as though presentation were inevitable. This happens whether the meal will be photographed or eaten alone in silence. You start to notice that consistency exists independent of audience, which contradicts the ordinary idea of performance as something built for an observer. This is not behavior aimed outward, and yet it carries the weight of something being proven. What is being proven and to whom is not yet visible at the surface. The persistence of the behavior across so many contexts is what forces the question deeper. Underneath this consistency sits a mechanism that explains why the behavior repeats without decay. I notice that competence in the kitchen produces a physiological calm not available to him elsewhere. Cortisol regulation through controlled, repetitive fine motor tasks is well documented in behavioral research. You can watch him breathe differently once the knife starts moving, slower, more even. He is not choosing calm consciously. His nervous system is locating a reliable source of it. I recognize this as a self-soothing mechanism disguised as domestic labor, functioning below conscious intention. It works because the kitchen offers immediate, visible feedback that most other domains of his life withhold. A reduced sauce tells him instantly whether his judgment was correct, without committee, review, or delay. His career, his relationships, his sense of contribution rarely offer that kind of immediate confirmation. Once a mechanism proves this reliable, the nervous system does not release it voluntarily.
I notice that he rarely names this calm directly, describing it instead as simply liking to cook. You can see the same regulation in other repetitive, tactile hobbies claimed by this generation, from woodworking to distance running. This raises the next question on its own. What happens when a mechanism this effective repeats for decades? A mechanism repeated for decades stops behaving like a mechanism and starts behaving like infrastructure. I noticed that he no longer experiences a choice before cooking. The sequence has become automatic. You see this most clearly on nights when he is exhausted and cooks anyway, without deliberation. He is not choosing the ritual anymore in any meaningful psychological sense. The ritual is choosing him, initiating itself the moment stress crosses a certain threshold. I recognize this shift from selected behavior to default behavior as the defining feature of the third decade of adulthood. What began as a coping tool has become indistinguishable from personality itself, worn as naturally as any inherited trait. You could no longer separate the man from the mechanism without leaving a visible absence. This raises an uncomfortable question the ritual cannot answer from inside itself. What happens to whatever the mechanism was originally protecting? I noticed that automaticity this complete usually requires years of uninterrupted reinforcement without exception or disruption. You can see this in how little conscious deliberation precedes the first cut of the onion. Something has to give way in order for automation this total to take hold. What gives way is rarely discussed because it disappears without a visible event marking its loss. I noticed that spontaneity around food has quietly narrowed into a small, repeatable set of options. He used to try unfamiliar cuisines in his 20s with a kind of reckless curiosity. You now watch him return to the same 5 techniques regardless of what ingredients are available. Curiosity has been replaced by reliability, and reliability was never the original goal. I see that improvisation, once a source of pleasure, now produces mild anxiety instead. The very flexibility that made cooking exciting to him initially has been slowly traded for control. This trade was never negotiated consciously. It happened one repeated choice at a time. You realize that what disappeared was not a skill, but a relationship to uncertainty itself. I noticed that this narrowing rarely announces itself as loss, since reliability feels like an upgrade while it is happening. You can watch him describe the narrowing as maturity, as knowing what he likes, rather than as a closing door. The loss of tolerance for uncertainty becomes the boundary the next layer has to explain. A diminished tolerance for uncertainty in one domain rarely stays contained to that domain alone. I notice that his relationship to cooking has started shaping his relationship to himself as a person. Being someone who cooks well has become part of how he answers the question of who he is. You can hear this in small phrasing choices when he says, "I don't really do that," about unfamiliar dishes. This is identity language, not preference language, and the difference matters more psychologically than it first appears to. I recognize that competence has migrated from an activity into a self-concept that requires ongoing defense. A self-concept built on competence needs regular proof, or it starts to feel unstable. You watch him become slightly defensive when a dish fails, more defensive than the stakes of dinner would justify. Failure here threatens something larger than a meal, though he would not phrase it that way himself. I notice that this defense appears strongest precisely in the domain that once felt entirely safe from failure. You can see how quickly a small culinary mistake gets reframed as a lesson rather than left as a simple error. This raises the layer beneath identity, the question of what identity is actually being asked to carry. Identity rarely exists in isolation from what a person believes they owe to others. I notice that his cooking often orients towards feeding people rather than feeding himself alone. You watch him cook larger portions than necessary, freezing the excess for people who have not asked for it. He experienced early in adulthood a narrowing of what reliable provision was supposed to look like. Providing money alone stopped being sufficient proof of care somewhere during his working life. I recognize that cooking has become a substitute language for a form of responsibility that feels otherwise undemonstratable. He can show up as dependable through a meal in a way that feels more legible than saying it aloud. You notice this most clearly around people he struggles to express concern for verbally. The meal becomes evidence of care that does not require the vulnerability of stating care directly. I notice that he rarely announces the gesture, leaving the food in the refrigerator to be discovered rather than delivered. You can read this quiet delivery as a preference for care that asks nothing of the receiver in return. This raises a further question about what happens when care is only expressible through an object. Care expressed only through objects changes the shape of the relationships receiving it.
I notice that people around him have learned to read the cooking as the primary emotional signal. You can watch a partner or a friend interpret an elaborate dinner as an apology never spoken aloud. He has effectively outsourced a portion of his emotional communication to technique and presentation. This works to a degree because food is a channel most people can receive without resistance. I recognize that this substitution also creates a quiet asymmetry inside close relationships. Those around him receive care fluently through food, but often struggle to receive direct verbal reassurance from him at all. You notice the relationship adapting to accommodate the channel rather than the channel adapting to the relationship. This raises the question of what the food is ultimately standing for beneath the immediate act of feeding. I notice that direct verbal reassurance, when it does arrive from him, often feels rehearsed rather than spontaneous. You can sense that indirection has become the safer channel precisely because it carries less risk of rejection. Something is being protected by keeping the communication indirect, and that something has not yet been named. What is being protected becomes visible only once the search moves past relationship into meaning itself. I notice that many of the men fitting this pattern describe their working lives with muted, functional language. You rarely hear purpose attached to a job title, but you hear it attached to a recipe perfected over years. He has, somewhere along the way, relocated meaning-making away from institutions and into domestic craft. I recognize this as a rational response to decades of watching meaning promised by employers evaporate on short notice. A kitchen does not restructure, does not get acquired, does not lay off the person standing in it. You start to see the ritual as an unconscious hedge against meaning collapsing again the way it once did elsewhere. This does not make the meaning less real, only differently located than institutions expect meaning to sit. I noticed that this relocation happened quietly, without a single deliberate decision marking its beginning. You can trace it instead through years of accumulated disappointment, each one nudging meaning a little further from institutions and closer to the counter. This raises the final and widest question about what this generation collectively failed to notice while relocating meaning this way. The collective blind spot only becomes visible from far enough outside any single kitchen. I noticed that an entire generation of men solved a crisis of trust by becoming self-sufficient rather than interdependent. You can see self-reliance treated as the mature response to institutions that broke earlier promises. He built competence as a private fortress rather than building a shared vocabulary for the original wound, and the fortress, however sturdy, was never the same thing as repair. I recognize that self-sufficiency, however impressive, is not the same achievement as emotional literacy. The kitchen absorbed the labor that conversation was supposed to absorb, and largely still has not. You notice that being needed through food has quietly substituted for being known through words. This substitution went unexamined for decades because competence photographs so well and vulnerability does not. The blind spot is not the cooking itself, which is a legitimate and considerable skill. I notice that this mistake is easy to make precisely because the logistics problem was genuinely difficult and genuinely solved. You can see how satisfying it is to master something measurable after years of institutions failing to reward loyalty. The blind spot is mistaking a solved logistics problem for a solved emotional one. I return now to the beginning of this investigation with nothing left to descend into further.
no layer remains unexplored, and none of the 7 ever operated apart from the others. The behavior fed the pattern fed the identity fed the obligation fed the relationship fed the meaning fed the blind spot. None of these layers caused the others in a simple line, they sustained each other simultaneously. You can now see the knife work from the very beginning as something entirely different than it first appeared. It was never only about dinner, and it was never only about skill either. He is still, in this final frame, only a psychological shape observable in ordinary life. You may recognize a version of this in someone close to you, or in yourself. That recognition, quiet and unannounced, is the only outcome this kind of observation was ever designed to produce. Another pattern sits just beyond this one, still unexplained, still waiting for the same kind of attention. He has not been fully accounted for yet, not by this investigation or any other. You are invited to keep watching for the next shape that repeats without being named, not to resolve it, only to keep noticing it the way this one was noticed. Thank you for staying with this analysis from its first observation to its last. Tell us which of these 7 layers felt most familiar when you recognized it in someone you know. Subscribe if you want to keep tracing these patterns as they surface in ordinary rooms. Turn on notifications for the next one because it is already forming somewhere in front of all of us. It remains unnamed for now, waiting for the same kind of attention this one just received.